Good evening, everyone from Ethnicity class. I hope you all are well. I don't expect a lot of people here tonight since this is actually not mandatory and is optional, but just feel like having a little conversation with everyone tonight. I've been doing that the last couple days, and I have to tell you, it's been some fascinating conversations that have taken place. I see that we have a couple people here. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself so I can see who I'm talking with at this point in time. Would kind of like to take a William Julius Wilson look at race and inequality in the United States as it pertains to violence and violent crime and lethal violence. So who's with me tonight? I'd love to know who it is. Hopefully everything is going well with the class. I think that we've ironed out most of the issues that have been circulating. As I've said in all my classes, this one included, it's just, this transition from a live environment into a virtual one has been a little bit tricky, for everyone, because a lot of people who are in these virtual classes, they want to be in live classes, but we just can't do it. And, it looks like everything is theoretically opening up for the fall, but I'll tell you, the spike that's taking place here in Florida, especially in Miami, it's pretty dramatic. So if we take a look at Texas, Arizona, take a look at Florida, the rates are flying up, and we'll see what happens as far as all that goes. But I'm looking forward to meeting everybody. So I see that there's one viewer with me. Who are you this evening? So I can just say hello and give you a special shout out, one-on-one kind of shout out. I suspect I may know who it may be, but would just like to know for sure. Maybe you could tell me what you feel like discussing this evening. We won't go long. I do have to continue working on that project I've been working on, but I did want to take a break out, and I've answered. I've been answering text message and emails all day. It's like hundreds a day. Well, not hundreds, but definitely 100 in a given day. But in any case, no one's out there. No one wants to say hello. Well, then I guess I'll just go ahead and start having a little conversation with, I guess, myself. But then again, I do that all the time, so it's not that big a deal. But in any case, I know that I want to apologize because I believe Monday, when we went to do our live stream, the live stream didn't work. So I immediately wrote up some announcements for you. I hope those made sense. But in any case, we'll live stream today, and then we'll live stream on Monday. But I do know that I put down the announcements in the Blackboard, so that you should be able to check out what's going on. But in any case, as we take a look at the new Brooks case in Atlanta, it seems that we have a very difficult scenario with this, with excessive force, police brutality, killing of innocent people who haven't really, certainly haven't warranted the death penalty. That, as someone was talking about earlier in the day, when you empower a group not to follow due process, then what happens is it undermines the whole notion of democracy. And really, one of the things we're talking about right now is that, what limits are we willing to discuss when it comes to the elimination or the questioning of due process, and how does it get convoluted and mixed in with ethnicity, race, and even social class? What about power? Issues of power as it pertains to the unchecked power of someone who has the ability to enforce the law. How does all that work out? It's just some interesting questions that I think I'd like to ask. But when I put things in perspective, one of my students in another class asked me today, I don't even know which class it was, a text message. They want to know what's the difference between culture and what's the difference between an institution. And so essentially, culture are the belief systems that we utilize to make decisions. It's the way that we construct meaning in life. So all those things such as ethics and values and meaning and religion, anything that shapes the way in which we think is actually a cultural phenomenon. On the other side are social institutions. And social institutions are designed to meet basic human needs. So what they are by definition are structured patterns of behavior that are designed to meet basic human needs. Pretty straightforward and simple. So the economic institution is designed for you and I to have the ability to exchange goods and services with one another with exchange value. So If, for example, I want to buy this cell phone, which you won't because it's kind of whacked out, but if you want to buy this cell phone from me, I can sell it to you for, say, $25, and you give me $25 worth of value. We've just had a market exchange, right? And, that's one way of distributing goods and services, is a pattern behavior. Basically, everything you purchase is based upon the fact that there's an economic institution that is in existence, and it just so happens our economic institution is a capitalist one, which is fine. Our political institution, theoretically, is a democratic one, and then we take a look at all the institutions. So the structure of behavior, the patterns of behavior, are structured by institutions. Our belief systems are structured by culture. So when they work together, they create for us what is called a stream. Now, not everyone uses a stream analysis. I just happen to love it because the stream analysis has a great power to combine a functionalist thought with a conflict theory thought, institutional forces with cultural forces, so that we can make an argument that we all swim in the same stream. And the question is, do the police, and this is a question came up before, in a civil society, do the police swim in the stream with everybody else if they have the power to make you do things that you wouldn't do to yourself, right? In other words, arrest yourself. So when we take a look at this stream, and we look at lethal violence, I can never get my glasses right, that's what I'm always touching. And we take a look at lethal violence. There's two forms of lethal violence that we usually only think in terms of homicide/murder. So when we think of homicide/murder, we tend to think of interpersonal forms of violation. But suicide is also the flip side of the same lethal violence stream. So if we're going to have a real discussion about lethality, it's really vital to take a look at what are the underlying features that shape both behaviors. Because so often, most people think that suicide, for example, is an individual behavior. The individual directs their anger towards themselves and they kill themselves. And we tend to think of that as, a mental health issue. We tend to think of that in terms of it being a psychological issue, typically depression, what have you. And that's certainly part of it. But when we really take a look at it more broadly, Emile Durkheim said that suicide is a social fact. And there are forces that underlie the behavior. So he notes that, and I can't remember him again, but he notes that there are 4 forms of suicide. You see, we tend to think of one. I end my life. But there's actually 4. One is called anomic suicide. Anomic suicide, based upon the term anomy, which some of you have looked up, anomic suicide is based upon this premise that if there is huge societal breakdown and the normative system shifts, that there are going to be responses or adaptations to the breakdown, right? And one such adaptation is, if I define myself as a failure during the breakdown and I don't see it as a systematic failure, I see it as mine, then I'm much more likely to commit suicide because of the anomy. Now, the people who are most affected by anomic suicide are white males between the ages of 45 and 54 because, for example, when there's a massive shift in the economic system in 2008 when the housing collapse took place. Oh, there you go. What's up, Sam? There we go. You and Durkheim, baby. You're going to be dating one day. No doubt about it. But what happens is that, weren't you the one that asked about anomy last time, the difference between anomy and alienation? Well, when anomy takes place, right, and people direct their anger towards themselves, you will see anomic suicide. So when average income for white males fell, when all the effort it took to get quote-unquote bachelor's degree, master's degree, when they couldn't get back into the workforce, had to take these massive pay cuts, they saw themselves as a failure, not the system. And based upon that, killed themselves. Now that kind of suicide is called anomic suicide. If, however, for example, a person feels completely left out of the belief system of society and they see themselves as a failure because their beliefs aren't working, then when they commit suicide, it's more likely to be considered egoistic. So if you're not regulated into society, it's anomic suicide. If you're not integrated into society, then it's going to be egoistic suicide. The other 2 types of suicide are altruistic suicide, which is where you are so ingratiated with the belief system of society that you kill yourself like a kamikaze pilot in Japan. You would kill yourself to show your incredible support for your nation, All right. Then the last one is I just had it on the top of my head. There's egoistic, altruistic, then there's anomic, fatalistic. All right. Fatalistic is the one where you feel so broken by your inability to fully participate in society, and actually, Sam, you may even say alienated. That but Durkheim wouldn't say that, but it's okay. It's the same kind of concept. When you're broken by society itself and you commit suicide, that's a fatalistic attitude. High risk behavior. You know, people who are willing to take a risk at the odds of ending their life, that is a fatalistic outlook. So when we take a look at suicide, and we never do this because we're so busy looking at homicide when it comes to lethal violence that we don't take a look at suicide. But suicide actually has all these structural components to it. And it's not just a psychological disorder. It's not just depression. If you take a look at the distribution of how suicide takes place, right? You have teenagers who commit suicide. Well, why do they do it? Bullying, essentially, right? And there may be depression wrapped in there, but many of those young people who commit suicide were bullied, especially with cyberbullying. I don't know if I could handle it. Some people get out here and they start really taunting you, and next thing you know, you're like, what are you doing? And it's in cyberspace, you can't find it off. But without the faculties to actually blend and figure out solutions to that, you have this level of suicide. Now, when you come to analyze that type of suicide for teenagers, it's different than people who are 45 to 50 years old who've been squeezed out by the economic system. So if we say suicide is terrible, 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 which it is, but we say that this one is just as bad or different than this one, we have to take a look at the structural forces are in fact different. And then the third group that has the highest rate of suicide, the second highest rate, are those who are like 75 to 85 years old who have lost all their companionship. They're socially isolated. They no longer have any kind of friendship network, and the people who are around them may or may not have any engagement with them. And what we see again is a fatalistic type, not fatalistic, egoistic type of suicide where they're not fully integrated into the social system. So what we're looking at is integration and regulation, right? So that's a lot different. So what happens is this. If it's less regulated, that means the forces of production, the economic institution, political institution, etc., are breaking down. So when those break down, then you might see suicide on that side. When people can't get integrated, it's because there's a cultural breakdown. So understanding the different types is really important. Going back to homicide. So why is it we spend more time talking about homicide than we do suicide? I think it has to do with who's in power and who's represented by those who are most likely to whack themselves, right? And then we take a look at homicide, and anytime we watch the news, the type of homicide we see is usually stranger-related homicide, overwhelmingly females as the victims of homicide, right? So what we get oftentimes is, you know, little kids who get, and I'm not saying, look, just because I say that this is what's portrayed doesn't mean I feel better that as a young person. No, I understand there's tragedy. I mean, if something happened to my kids, I'd be broken. And I'm not saying that those aren't tragedies, but what I'm saying is that the over-reliance and portrayal of those rare events, right, distort our attention away from the events that we really need to be focusing on even more. Because a stray bullet hitting somebody is a lot different than somebody who is in an argument with someone over identity, over masculinity, because there's alcohol involved, and which is the most common form of homicide. But those aren't the ones that are reported. And the ones that are reported are stranger-related, right? A woman who gets killed, especially if she's on the street, and then a little kid who gets killed in an accidental shooting, right? That's what gets reported. But what it does is it really essentially distorts what is actually the patterns that are taking place, which is this. You know, when we try to drive down the rate of homicide, you know, what we have to look at is the forces of production. Because the forces of production are the ones that create the context, the economic and the education context, the political context in which that anger is exerted outwardly. Now, there may be a belief, internal belief, that with masculinity, you can't control me. I have the right to protect myself, etc. From a cultural, yes, absolutely. We're absolutely obsessed with homicide as our crime of choice. And the reason why we're really fascinated with serial murders And, I mean, in the most morbid sense, they are fascinating, but I've never been a big proponent of studying that for the fact that, when I used to teach the sociology of murder back at the University of Louisville, there was one professor who used a whole lot of photographs because he was a profiler, and he had all these photographs of Ted Bundy. He's interviewed him, and John Wayne Gacy, and everyone. And he was able to get the pictures, and he had all kinds of horrific photos of young kids being mutilated, and it was just the students gravitated to that class, and so ever since Jack the Ripper, and Lizzie Borden were the two that really changed that profile, because it was the media that represented the Jack the Ripper case, and Lizzie Borden because she was such a out of the ordinary killer, with her being a female killer who whacked her parents 52 times each with an axe back in the late 1800s. It was so inconceivable that a woman could be so heinous that she was actually acquitted of the crime, and even though all the evidence clearly pointed that she did it, it was never proven. But the reason, and there's a really important reason why we why we overemphasize serial homicide and mass murder and stuff like that, because we want to get inside the criminal mind. We are obsessed with this idea that these persons are somehow sick, that these persons are somehow mentally depraved, and we want to figure out what makes them tick. The unfortunate thing is, and it's very complicated to get into, and I'm not going to get into that discussion right now, but when you take a look at serial homicide, mass homicide is an expression of an underlying structure, just like any other type of homicide. It's overwhelmingly European Americans that are the perpetrators. And there's reasons for that. It's the same reason as the suicide, is that once you marginalize persons onto a margin, and there's very little room for the type of expression, and you see that there's this anger. For example, Timothy McVeigh clearly had anger towards the U.S. government, right? He had the Turner Diaries in his truck. His buddy, what was his name? Timothy McVeigh and Mark, I can't remember his name right offhand. They both had the Turner Diaries, which is like a Bible for hate groups, particularly the ones out of Michigan. Because Michigan, he had an affiliation with the Michigan militia. And the Michigan militia certainly believed that the government was controlled by a Zionist-occupied government, so therefore they had a belief that it was their duty to attack a federal building. And hold on a second, I'll answer that in just a second. And so by attacking the federal building, they were responding to the execution of Jonathan Snell in Arkansas, who was, he allegedly, he had killed a police officer, and it was alleged that he did it in self-defense, but he got executed. But he was a far right-wing leader of, a militia group. And so he became, on April 20th, which was also Adolf Hitler's birthday, in which he was executed, and Waco, Texas went down on April 20th. So the conspiracy theorists believed that the government was trying to control those who wanted to have their constitutional rights upheld, and that the Zionist-occupied government was undermining the system. So Timothy McVeigh, white male, decides to take it upon himself to symbolically attack everything that represented that occupying government. And so you oftentimes get these persons that are on the fringe margin who find a philosophy that supports what they believe in, and then it's not a psychosis, it's not a sociopathic, which it is, but they take it out on an object knowing that there's going to be mass destruction. So oftentimes you'll find some kind of underlying, you'll find some underlying feature like that when it comes to a mass murder. There's a lot of mental health issues. The dude out at Aurora, in the movie theater, and of course the guy up at Sandy Hook. There were and the guy at Virginia Tech. Now there were definite psychological issues, and people believe that those could have been prevented, which I believe that probably they could have, especially Virginia Tech. However, here's our problem: is that when it comes to those kind of threats, we have a very ethnic type of perspective on who's capable of such lethal violence. And a lot of times, for example, Columbine, we knew that there were signs that there was violence that was about to jump off. And a lot of times people who engage in mass murder, well, you see me pop that mosquito, mass murder will tell somebody what they're planning on doing. And just like suicide, I say, people say, I don't think I'm going to go on much longer. But because they don't portray or represent the stereotypical profile of what a lethal, violent actor is, then oftentimes our heads get turned, and then they go off and do it. We say, oh my God, they must have been crazy or whatever. But by painting them as crazy, it does us the favor of saying, well, if it's in their head, then the threat isn't widespread. Well, by looking at what's going on in the head only, saying every time this happens it's crazy, 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 we're really looking away from the underlying structural forces that contextualize all of our behavior, right? So let me take a look at your question, Sam. So, Professor, pardon me if I'm interrupting too. Yeah, man, you're not interrupting. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it at all. It's your class. If we were in a live class, I'd be like asking everyone to participate. Forces of production and what was the other force you mentioned in the previous class? Okay, forces of production are just like they sound, right? What produces the economic system? Education institution, that's part of force production, the political institution, and namely the economic institutions. Those shape one of the barriers of the river, of the stream, if you think of it that way, right? So the bank of the stream is shaped by the forces of production. Because those are external forces to the individual, right? Those forces have the strength of creating and propagating economic inequality, right? Of all kinds of types. And once they're resting in the institution and the boundaries become real in the pursuit of intergenerational mobility, once those boundaries are blocked, that individual or the group in the aggregate are more likely to express their anger outwardly. So when persons are being crushed by the forces of production, they tend to have a present orientation of time. Why? Because if I don't have any money, I don't know how long it is I'm going to survive anyhow. I don't know what tomorrow holds. So when I have a survival orientation, when you threaten me and I'm already struggling, then that becomes a threat to the only thing I have left, which is my identity, right? So the forces of production are the things that are the underlying force to homicide. So we know that when homicide has a higher rate than suicide within a community, we know that it is the forces of production that are having the greatest impact on the behavior. The only exception is anomic suicide, right? Because for white males, when those forces of production break, that white male doesn't fit into that economic order any longer, and they internalize it as their fault. See, they internalize it because on average they have a high school degree or more, they have a college degree or more, and they have internalized a future orientation. So when there's a breakdown in the force of production, my future orientation is regarded as a failure, and I turn the anger back on myself, and I end it here. If I am structurally have less education in the aggregate, right, less economic advantage, then the external forces is where I'm going to direct my attention, right? So if you become the threat to me surviving, or you become the threat to me being a full man and masculine, then you become the target of my aggression. And this is the reason why the number one form of homicide in the United States is what? Friends killing friends. It's not, well, once you remove stranger-related homicide from the picture, which we know are economic crimes, right? So the majority of felony homicides that go unsolved, stranger-related homicides, are tied to robbery, tied to drugs, gang-related activity, those kind of things. Now, when the stream is at work, we know that there's a very systematic structure to crime. There's not crazy fluctuations. There are patterns that are undeniable. For example, if you go back to 1930 till now, the crime rate has gone up and down, but it's gone between a maximum point of 10.3 to a minimum point of 4.4, 4.5. Up and down between homicide, that is, right? It will not break through those unless there's a massive institutional change within society, according to Enrico Ferri, actually supported by Emil Durkheim. So for us to have an explosion above 10 per 100,000 or fall beneath 4.5 per 100,000, something massive would have to change, right? Now, when you take a look at Detroit with its 50 per 100,000, or East St. Louis or New Orleans, not Miami, because Miami is at 9 per 100,000 now. It's still higher, but it's not the same as like DC and other places. So we want to know in those places what is going on with the stream that is taking the level of homicide so much higher, the rate, that is, not the level, but the rate above 5.5 per 100,000. When you identify what those forces are, then you can build social policies to address that. And it's likely that anomic suicide will be higher in those places than the other forms. But that's really hard to measure because people haven't measured that per se. But we can say this. When the forces of production are at work, the voice of lethal violence is going to be more homicidal. In other places, when it's the cultural barriers that are at work, then it's going to be more suicidal. So the expression of lethal violence is going to be based upon the nature of the stream that is flowing that affects all of us. Because we're all affected by culture and we're all affected by society. Whew, there's a ton right there. But all I'm saying is the reason we know there's a stream that flows is simply for the fact that there are some very strong patterns that underlie all this behavior. For example, everyone wants to get into a debate about gun control. Now, that's fine. It's a great debate. It's fantastic. And the time that we really talk about is when some guy goes up in the 32nd floor of a hotel room and he guns down 50 people and he kills them, or he goes into the Pulse nightclub and kills 50 people. But when we start to take a look at mass murder in the United States, mass murder accounts for, 130 murders out of 14,000 in a given year? And it's probably even less, but we'd say it's much more. It's not much more, right? It's only a certain percentage every single year. So what that means is that there's a pattern underlying mass murder. Our question is, rather than looking at this craziness, what is a part of the pattern that keeps it afloat like that? Homicide by street gang members. Oh, gangs are horrible, they do this. If you go back for the last 20 years, street gangs account for roughly 4 to 6%, basically 5% of all homicides in the nation. Not 30, not 45, right? If you take a look at who's the number 2 group to engage in homicide, friends on friends, 1. And number 2, husbands killing wives, right? Well, that's not on the news. There might be a big drive-by with some street gang, you might see that. You're definitely going to see a mass murder, but we don't even talk about the most frequently occurring crimes. Why is that? Why is it we don't want to take a look at the nature of relationships, intimate relationships, and friendship relationships to really get down to what is taking place? Because if you take a look at what's really taking place with those particular homicides, you would find something very, very fascinating. And that is most of the myths that we have about crime are absolutely incorrect. As a matter of fact, most of them are inverted and flipped upside down. What would you find? If you start taking a look at the age crime structure of homicide, right? What is the age distribution of those who commit it and those who are killed, right? Those who are the victims of homicide. Most people like to think for some reason that is 16 to 18, that is both the highest offending and is also the highest rate of victimization. It's third, okay? It's ranked number 3. But number 1 are those persons 19 to 25 and then 26 to 30. Those are the 1 and 2 categories. So if we started to take a look at the age structure of homicide, then that would tell us a whole different story than what's going on. Namely, what we would find out in a pretty quick instant is that if you take a look at the rate of unemployment in the neighborhoods in which these persons live, you see that the neighborhood structure of the labor force is pretty darn weak. Right? Then you also find that the average the high school graduation rate is lower, and you find that the unemployment rate is higher. So if we start to take a look at the economic underpinnings of those communities where there are hot spots, and by the way, it's not just hot spots. If you take a look at chronic offending patterns, and what is a chronic offender? Right? A chronic offender is a person who has had 5 arrests in their lifetime. All right? And Marvin Wolfgang, who did a famous study, Delinquency in the Birth Cohort in 1947, what he found is that out of these 10,000 kids born that year, 5.1% of them had been arrested 5 or more times. And that 5.1% represented 51% of all arrests. Now here's what's so important about the chronic offender. They represent 51% of all arrests, but there's a thing called the law of criminal penetration. The further you push a person or a group of people in the aggregate into the criminal justice system, the deeper their lifestyle involvement becomes in crime. So when you push this group of people further and further into the system, right, what happens is they pick up a criminal lifestyle. How do you do that? You're socialized and you learn cultural values from other people like yourself. Edmund Sutherland called it differential association theory, right? You learn how to be a criminal from other people similarly situated. Right? So we take a look at this. The chronic offenders account for 51% of all arrests. About 65 to 70% of burglary arrests. Look how they get more severe. 72 to 74% of all robbery arrests, and 92% of homicide arrests. So when we take a look at homicide, we're looking at a small handful of people that account for 92% of those crimes. And they've been arrested 5 or more times. And they're located, they live in what are called hotspots. In urban areas, often urban areas, but not necessarily urban. In Kentucky, there's places in eastern Kentucky that have rates of homicide that are higher than any place in the state of Florida, right? Or at least they did traditionally up until around 2010. I don't know what the rates are now, but through 2010, there were some counties in eastern Kentucky, in the coal-producing counties, that had homicide rates around 36 per 100,000. Absolutely. Now, when you talk about an occupying territory, my favorite theory that you can look this one up, Sam, is called internal colonization theory. That is, when you have little communities that are actually colonies of a broader system. In other words, when the economic landowners, when the economic business owners live outside the territory, right, and they control how you live, where you live, how the flow of money is coming into the community, that's an internal colony. So what happens in an internal colony, and you can look this up, whether it was South Africa or what have you, when you have an internal colony, what is amazing is that the colonizers no longer have to be the enemy. What they do is they create a system where there's economic disparity, economic inequality. And the persons within the community see one another as the enemy. So the Crips and the Bloods are enemies of one another, right? But the most amazing thing is their social location in the social system is exactly the same, right? So we have people who want to kill each other over an area code or a zip code or the name of a street or the name of a building or the name of, whatever. Why? It makes zero sense. Because here's the reason why. Because once you get, like immigrants, right? If you're looking at, especially in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, or even the 1800s, when you had a lot of migration in, Thorsten Selene called when you had areas where there was ethnic conflict, which is perfectly appropriate for this class. On those fringes between the neighborhoods where there was ethnic conflict, he had a thing that was called culture conflict. And culture conflict are contiguous neighborhoods, contiguous areas that are enemies and rivals of one another. And because of their background, ethnic background, belief systems, they will engage in, back then, street fighting and stuff like that. Some homicide in Philadelphia, but it definitely created conflict. If you go back and read some of the books of people who have written autobiographies in New York City and how the city was broken apart in terms of ethnicity. One, when ethnic groups move into a community, they tend to move into areas with persons like themselves, right? And then what happens is they pass the cultural values in, and I think this happens in Miami according to what I've heard. So they pass on cultural values, and then those values may come in competition or conflict with those who come from other areas or at different times, right? And there's conflict between those particular two groups. So culture conflict is real. Internal colonization is real. But going back to the internal colony, what happens is that when the colonized believe in the stereotypes that the ones who threaten them the most are also the same colonized group sharing the same characteristics. Yes, that's where the networks are. That is where the enemy lives. So when we see homicide, it's almost always inter-ethnic. It's definitely within race, right? So the colony becomes a social network. And oftentimes the police are outside that social network, and they become the enemy, right? The enemy is the economic system. No particular individual, but the system itself. But our experience within the system defines individuals as the ones who are the greatest threat. Why? Because the stereotypes say that this person and this group of people here is a threat to us. And during moments of interpersonal conflict, it's not just a threat to us, it's a threat to my masculinity. I keep talking about masculinity because 92% of those who kill are males and the 85% who get killed are males. So when we take a look at the distribution of homicide, it is really a male endeavor. So what we don't take a look at in all this, we never take a look at what is it about maleness in this competitive society where there's economic disadvantage and economic breakdown that people turn against one another who should be friends, who are friends, and they regard one another as the enemy. Right? Why would someone kill their friend over $5? Why? It doesn't have anything to do with the $5. It has everything to do with you disrespecting me and my manliness, my masculinity. So I, by definition, especially in this environment when there's scarce resources, when you have scarce resources, what do you have? You have your courage, you have your strength, you have your ability to stand up to authority and challenge. That's what you become defined as, right? So, and I know because this is how our neighborhood was, man. Come on, if every time we wanted to play baseball, we had to fight with one another to get on there. Oh my God, we're always fighting on the basketball court. And I was tiny. I mean, I was only 4'8" when I graduated from 8th grade. Man, I still had to fight. I still had to stand up for myself because if I didn't, my mother would say, if you won't stand up for yourself, who will stand up for you? So, boy, you better get out there and fight. So I was fighting when I was itty-bitty. My first fight was in kindergarten. Me and my good buddy, we got into a fight, and it was kind of a crazy one. We became best friends afterwards, but I didn't have a problem fighting. I had to. Why? Because I had to protect my identity. If I wanted to go outside and play, I had to be masculine. And if I wasn't masculine, then I had to confront corporal punishment in my home. So for someone like myself, when there's economic deprivation and there's always this ongoing threat, we were taught that you had to stand up for yourself, right? So you throw that mentality into all this, and then you throw in something like alcohol and how alcohol escalates, right? 50% of all homicides, the victim and the offender, I think, both of them, but at least for sure I know that 50% of the situations had alcohol involved, will escalate into a homicide. So let's look at it. We're looking at how does the stream flow, right? What is your social location in the networks within the stream? Is it a colonized place? And we're taking a look at what's more impactful right now, forces of production or forces of culture. Because when we figure that out, we can then start to address it. But here's what we know. Another one of the patterns. No matter what you do, I was talking about gun control. Look, 70% of all homicides, 68 to 72, take place with a firearm. About 1%, 1.5% take place with an automatic weapon, right? AK-47 or something like that. It's a firearm. So 70%, and it doesn't matter if it's 1950, it doesn't matter if it's 1970, 2020. 70% is what's going to happen. Doesn't matter how strong you get on guns, how weak you are on guns, it's 70%. And there's a reason why. And the reason why is really simple. Because we don't take a look at the nature of the distribution. If the people who are killing and getting killed are between the ages of 19 and 29, they're much more likely to use a firearm and lethal violence. They're much more likely to be disengaged from the economic system. And we were talking about this, Sam, the other day. If they're alienated, that is, they're detached from work, they're broken away from society, detached from self and detached from nature. If they're detached and they're angry, the odds of having homicide, especially if there's many people like this in an area, then you're going to have more homicide in that particular area. It's not really hard. Economic breakdown. It's not about race. It's about the economics of race, right? William Julius Wilson out of University of Chicago makes that argument. He said it's about the truly disadvantaged. It's not an issue of race. It's an issue of class. And if we're not going to fix class, then we can't fix the issues pertaining to race and ethnicity either. And so what happens is you have this congregation of all these belief systems. You have all these structural systems that are at play in this place. And what's going to happen? There are spots where a lot more crime takes place. They're called hot spots. Just like 5% commit 51% of the crimes that lead to an arrest, 5% of the places in a community account for over 50% of the calls to police. Right? So what you have is this overlap between all these forces. And nobody wants to take a look at where does the anger come from. We want to take a look at that individual being somehow demented, mentally unstable, etc., rather than looking at what is the source of the instability. Then we take a look at the next one, the opioid addiction in the same communities, or opioid addiction in general. Instead of saying, what's the pain that's leading to the opioid addiction, we say, oh, these poor people, let's fix them. Instead of saying, what's the source of the pain? What's the source of the pain that leads someone to make the discussion that, okay, because gun control is interesting to me, right? If we removed all the guns, would there still be murder? Well, there's that question. There's a murder. There's a question that if we remove all guns and firearms, would the government then have the ability to take over and institute a totalitarian regime? All very interesting conversations, right? But I've always wondered this question. What was the internal conversation that led this person to pull this trigger? And it seems like if alcohol is involved 50% of the time, that the alcohol changed the script. So persons who would have had enough impulse control to maybe throw a punch or two and walk away, now the impulse is, I've got to control this situation, and my rage is coming out, and you, my friend, are the enemy, and I deface you, I call you a whole bunch of nasty names, and by calling you these names, you are no longer a face to me. You are the enemy. And once you become the enemy, you become the target of aggression. And this is what happens in marriages, right? It's my fault. It's your fault that I haven't risen up. It's your fault that I can't build a better life. It's your fault. It's your fault. It's your fault. You no good blank. Boom. Now you're defaced. Now it's easier to harm you because you are no longer fully human. And what you really are is a threat to my masculinity. And if it happens long enough, eventually there's going to be a violent explosion. And that's what we know. Number one group to kill is friends on friends. Number two group is husbands killing wives. Statistical facts, I didn't make it up. And it's every year. So the question is, why are we not focusing on these things? Why are we focusing on those? And why are we focusing on suicide? Because if last year there were 14,900 victims of homicide, but there are 32,000 victims of suicide, why are we not looking at the stream in a different way? Is it because it's easier to look at homicide? Because if we have to look, think of it this way. If forces of direction, that is culture, affects the belief systems of those who take their own life, then we got to change the belief systems in society. And if it is males 45 to 50, or 54 who are white that have the highest rate of suicide out there, then you're talking about the group of people who holds the most power in society in terms of the economic institution, political institution, etc., all the institutional orders, the media institution. If you're in control of those institutions, how then, absolutely a political purpose. I mean, absolutely, right? So if these persons maintain even political power, how then they're going to turn around and say, but look, the most lethally violent group in America are white males. If that becomes the discussion because of suicide, if white males become defined as the most lethally violent group in America, how does that change our political system? How does that change the narrative for any kind of discussion on gun control? How does it change the way in which we look at one another in terms of race and ethnicity? How does that change the way in which we police urban inner cities, right? Oh, coming back to that for a second. So when you have an overlap between chronic offenders and a hotspot with prevailing definitions that you and I are really the enemies rather than our conversational capability, rather than the way in which we engage in internal constructions of conversation, then we're taking a look at the wrong question. Because it seems to me that if we really want to do something about lethal violence, you start to restructure the way education operates, right? You restructure the way people have internal conversations of gesture. You teach from kindergarten on or preschool, and you formalize it as conflict management. And I'll tell you what, I actually make this conclusion in my book, A Mother Cries, Lethal Violence in the Zombie Apocalypse. My ultimate conclusion is, and it's so freaking goopy, I can't even believe it, but it is an absolute fact. If you can instill upon people the idea of hope, right? Even when everything else is lost, if you still have hope that there's a possibility for a better life, which is a future orientation to your life, right? If you can say that I still have hope that the future can still be better, then you have a structure from which to build. And so, why do we not teach more things pertaining to hope? And here's the other thing. Oh, brother, here we go. Now, this isn't supposed to be goopy, okay? But it's a fact. The other thing that's not taught is love, okay? We don't teach you how to love yourself. We don't teach us how to love other. And we don't verify very well how to teach us to love the God of our choice, right? So without that attachment, without this attachment, without this attachment, how then are we supposed to have any kind of peace of mind, right? If you can't love yourself, how should anyone else love you? And if you're incapable of loving someone else, how are they going to love you? Right? How can you keep going on if you can't love yourself? Now that becomes really complicated. So, what is that? Well, love, again, we think of it as a psychological state, right? And it is, I guess. I mean, you experience love and heart does some funny things. Your stomach starts to quiver. Mine does, I'm not going to lie. And it still does, even though I'm 54, and it does it just like I used to when I was young. Lisa comes around, Jamie, oh my, hello. And then, you just go down the road. The heart would flutter. The heart would sound. Here comes Sonia. Ooh, Jennifer. Oh, heart's fluttering all over the place. So there's that emotional type of love. However, if we regard love, remember, go back to that institutional chart. The institution shape networks, and networks shape small groups shape who you are. And you are an emotional response to every relationship that you have. Then what love then is, it is a role relationship guided by meaning of trust, respect, and admiration that has a commensurate emotional component to it. But if it is a role relationship guided by expectations that has an emotional component, then what you really need to do if you want love to be an integrating force in the stream is you, first of all, when you become a parent or you are a parent, first thing you do, and this should be a policy, this should be the first freaking policy, because chronic offenders, all right, they have a lifestyle that starts long before they're 19 years old, correct? I mean, age crime, lambda, peaks at the age of 16 for property crime, and individual crime rates peak for violent crime at the age of 18. Well, if you look at an age crime curve, crime never disappears. Crime never I can't do this. Crime never disappears for the fact that chronic offenders continue offending at a higher rate than everybody else in society. So we flip it back the other way. If the curve is here, and the rate continues for this group of people, and it goes in perpetuity like this, it is likely that their behavior started back here, right? And it is likely that they are exhibiting, they're exhibiting behavior patterns that showed that there is potential trouble forthcoming. And we can identify this around the age of 8, around the age of 6 to 8. So 6 to 8 really is the critical point. If you want to do something about homicide, you can't do much about it by the time someone's angry because they can't find a job and everyone around them is deprived of occupational opportunity, right? By 16, 17, 18 years old, they're already developing a fixed set of beliefs and they're looking for things to support that perception. It's called selective perception. If I'm looking for things to support the way I feel about race, ethnicity, social class, how people treat me, etc., it's already pretty much fixed. It can be changed. It can definitely be changed, but it's a big process to change it. But at the age of 6 and at the age of 8, it can be changed because beliefs are still formulating. So if you really want to take a look at a massive opportunity to address crime, first thing we do, I can't believe I'm talking about that. I'm going to talk about it though. You place that child on your knee at the age of 0, right when they're born, all the way until they go to school, and you teach them how to read. You read to them. You're giving them the language of professionalism, the language of the middle class. When you learn to read early, right, and you read to your children, they're now being introduced into the mechanism that's going to be able to drive them away from some of those criminogenic factors found in a hot spot. That's 1. 2, the other thing it does is when you read to that child every day for an hour or 2, the magic that happens with that is that that parent and that child develop a social bond that is inseparable. And that bond is what is going to create the system of trust. And when the criminogenic factors start to play in and those influences of the neighborhood start to play out, what's going to happen is that bond is going to be built upon trust and respect. And now I can turn to this person, my parents or whomever, my bigger brother or sister, and say, hey, look, this is what's happening, right? I'm being pushed around. Someone's threatening to assault me sexually or whatever. Now that door is open and they're threatening to fight or whatever. Now I can do something about it. So you have 2 things. 1, you have a language system that's being developed young. And 2, you have that bond between the parent and the child. And here's what happens. When you teach this communication system, and you develop a future orientation to time. It's not like I'm going to say I love you and then all of a sudden I'm going to marry everybody, but you can love others as you love thyself. Is that correct? Right? Especially if it means mutual respect and admiration, all those kind of things. I mean, I always love my students. I love my classes because, one, I don't know what you've gone through. Two, here you are. Three, we're in this together, baby. We're in this together. And so when I enter into a classroom, it's not based upon being a teacher. It never is. I'm a student and I love you guys. That bond alone, and some of you know, if you're struggling or whatever, you can reach out to me and I'm going to handle your situation in a way that's going to get you through this system, right? Because, you know, when my mother tried to whack me when I was 15, and I had all these other kinds of things that were going on. I talked about this yesterday in one of my videos. You know, I was hospitalized several times over severe and significant beatings, right? So next thing I know, I'm blacking out in school, and mom's, you know, she's getting all mad and knocking me out and things like that. And then when I'm 15 years old, she tries to kill me. You think I'm really thinking about school? Are you serious? I'm wondering if I'm going to get whacked when I get home. And everyone's talking about my sexuality because I refused to date when I was a teenager, strictly because Irma Jean, who is Mama Green's daughter, told me every day, don't go out there and date because if you get somebody pregnant, she's going to block your goals. If you start dating, she's going to get in the way of you achieving your dreams. And I'm like, oh, God. And then she'd point all the people who are teenage fathers and teenage females who were mothers and all the promiscuous stuff going on, all the sexual assault. She said, just stay away and just keep on your path. Keep in your lane and move forward. So, you know, I'm sitting here saying, don't you dare. I once kissed Lisa by the tree. I don't know, I was 13, 14, 15 years old. She said, get out of here, you heifer. Let that fast asshole go home. Get in here, Sean. And I was like, oh. So I didn't want to kiss her again. And I didn't want to kiss anybody because if it got back to her, she's going to flip out. And so rather than people understanding what I was about and the fact that I was sexually assaulted when I was 12, well, 8, 9, 12, twice, something like that. And then an attempted one when I was 15 or something like that. Oh, and another one when I was 8. Yeah, okay. So anyhow, these sexual assault type of situations really make you question things. Then you have Irma Jean breathing down your neck. So now everyone's telling everyone in my school district that I'm gay. I'm like, I'm not gay. I'm just not interested in dating anybody. So now I've got all these rumors that are being spread. I've got omnipotent threat of violence every single day. And I'm supposed to go to school and concentrate? When I go home, I know I'm going to a place where they'd be just as happy as I left. And then when I walk down the street, like my best friend Eric, he never let me go home on the school bus. He took me home from the day he turned 16 until the day we graduated. We carpooled home. He lived in the suburb. His parents, a fantastic family. His sister ended up being, she was on the cover of Time magazine as the education czar of America. As a matter of fact, his sister Michelle was offered the Secretary of Education job by both Barack Obama and by Donald Trump. And John McCain said that if he had won the election, he would have offered her the job too. So she's a bigwig, right? Harvard graduate. You know, everybody in my carpool went to an Ivy League school. There was, except Brian. Brian went, and Brian, ironically, Eric's youngest brother, was in my class at Ohio State. He got a B+, and his mom was all mad at me. I was like, oh God, I'll change the grade. Don't worry about it. And so Eric went to Columbia. Michelle went to Harvard. Mark, I think, went to Colgate or Dartmouth, and his brother Ted went to one of those two, and then Pete went to an Ivy League school, and Brian went to Ohio State. And it ended up my carpool was this incredibly powerful group of people, huge thinkers. But when they came home, when they dropped me off at my house, I told them stories about all these drug dealers, you know, the prostitutes, the young girls who were prostituting, and you know, everybody had a story. Donnie Shepard, who fell from the balcony of it was called the Bar Tavern. It was on the corner of Fassett Street and Oak, which none of that matters to you, but he was really intoxicated one night. He fell through the hole in the fire escape, landed on his head, and rolled down the stairs into the basement. Basically crushed his skull, but he did live. He lived, but he was never the same. So I'd see these people. I'd say, hey man, check this dude out. This dude right here, he smokes a lot of weed. That one over there, you got to stay away from him. He's high all the time. That dude right there, he'll kill you. And so I'm telling them these stories all the time. And Eric would never let me go home, not on my own. But when I think in terms of cultural capital, right, those belief systems that you bring into the stream with you, I had a very, very challenging position because on the one hand, I go to this private school where vocabulary. Everything is vocabulary. Everything's focused on SATs and all that kind of stuff, and writing well, and writing at a high level. And then when I go back home, it's about how do you protect yourself from omnipotent violent threat. Oh, another one too. When I was, how old was I? I was 8 again. I must have been a hot little dude when I was 8, because they were all trying to give a shot. I don't know what the problem was, but it was a scary situation. It's humiliating, and things happen along the way, and you're like, oh my God, are you serious? This again? Anyhow, I won't get into that. I'll save that for a live class. That's where I really can go off and tell stories. But in any case, think about the capital I'm carrying around, right? I got the great social linkages on both sides of the fence. I have cultural capital that allows me to walk into different ethnic environments, social class environments, educational environments, business environments. I was very blessed that way. But it was so hard because, that ongoing threat. So, when I went to school, when my mom tried to end my life, she ripped my shirt off with her nails, because she and her Gene used to keep their nails sharpened in a point, so if anyone ever attacked them, they could swipe them and then slice them. And so, to make a long story short, she sliced me down my back before she tried to hit me in the head with a cast iron skillet, and it ripped the shirt off my back. And anyhow, I survived it, obviously. And when she left for work, I lay down in the kitchen in my own blood, and I couldn't decide whether I wanted to live any longer, which would have been egoistic suicide, right? Because I didn't feel integrated into the home environment. And so I had this going on, but then I have this threat, and there's always a threat of homicidal violence, especially during this period of time in my home, in the home. I saw 4 potentially homicidal events within 6 months, including mine. And, well, 5 if you include the fact that Mama Green put the gun up to my mother's head and said, if you ever touch him again, I'll shoot you, I'll kill you dead. And so I guess that's a threat. Yeah, it's a threat. So anyhow, I call her up, she picks me up, and I go to school the next day, and it was the end of basketball season, the beginning of baseball season, right? No, my gosh, where's my head? It was the end of soccer season moving into basketball season, because it was November 1st. I call it the Halloween Massacre of '81. And so I go to speak to my advisor, and I say, hey, Al, I got a problem. He said, what is it, Shawnee? Shawnee, you always call me Shawnee. I said, I can't go to gym class. I can't play sports for a while. Can you help block for me? He said, why? What's wrong? Are you hurt? I said, no, I'm not hurt. I'm fine. He said, but then what's wrong? And I just said, Al, all right. I said, turn around. And I pull up my shirt, and I show him my back. And the guy starts to cry, right? Because they knew stuff was going on. The teachers just didn't know what was going on, but they knew something was going on because my grades are plummeting, and, I'm always in my head all the time. Still funny as shit, though, making people laugh all the time. But that was, it's just a mask. Once you learn how to wear that mask, that symbolic mask, then you can hide from other people. And I was a master of it because I use humor, and I use jokes, and I use sports to mask everything, right? That's why I can see people so well. It's because when you bend down these roads, you can see behind the mask. You can't fool a person that's wearing the same mask you are. How are you going to fool me? I'm wearing the violent survivor mask. I'm wearing the sexual survivor mask. All these acts, and you're going to try to trick me and act like I can't see you, but most people can't because it's a mask, and we all wear a mask, right? Because we're always trying to protect our we're using our virtual self to protect our authentic self, because we don't want someone coming in here and hurting us and hurting our heart. So we protect ourselves with it, which leads to a lot of violence, right? So, oh, hey Sandra, what's happening? Good seeing you. So when we take a look at how these things converge, I go to school, and Al Getman, he talks to all the other teachers. He has a special faculty meeting, and he says, everybody, and remember, I went to this elite private school. It's number one school in the state of Ohio right now. And he says, we got to take care of our boy Sean, because this kid is under really deep duress. And so what happened was everyone started reaching their hand out, and they just started carrying me as best they could, whether it was giving me a math exam by myself in the library, or whether I get to have an extra couple days to write a paper, or instead of having a formal written exam, I get an oral exam where I can speak instead of having to do certain things. So As it turned out, these teachers gave me a chance. They weren't giving me a chance. See, this is why I know that love and hope within network systems and structural systems are the solutions to violent crime. Because what they expressed was their concern. But what they were doing was loving this kid. And so I know for a fact that the combination of love and a combination of hope, when it is embedded in a structural system, in a network system, we can affect change immediately. We can do it. We can take violent offenders and allow them to experience something that they haven't experienced before, which may be love, and they have the opportunity to do something else. So when I say love is the answer to violent crime, it's because it's a very complex web of network associations, etc. Now, here's where it gets really tricky, especially in this current climate, all right? Now, our society, when it looks at minority groups and it puts it on the media, it's not one of love, unless it's one of entertainment. It's one of threat, it's one of omnipotent, disparaging commentary, and it's one that reinforces stereotypes that have gone back for 150, 160 years. So here on the one hand, we have all these stereotypes that are defining the nature of relationships, and it's defining the way in which we love certain types of groups, right? So there's one component of it, but on the other component of it is, and this is where it gets really fascinating, is that the police, by definition of having been brought from the early 1900s through a crime control model of policing. Remember, from 1910 through 1970 through 1992 with Rodney King, it was a crime control model of policing. So it gets socialized that if you break the law, we're bringing you down. All right. So you have this, all this. You better believe it, Sandra. You better believe it. You know, when you take a look at 100 years of professional socialization, that this is how it's to be done, and you have a system of hatred based upon arbitrary and capricious constructions of the meaning of race and ethnicity, which I think is class, right? But if you have an arbitrary and capricious set of boundaries and definitions, then this group here, who is hired to manifest and control the status quo, rightfully or wrongfully under a crime control model, is going to do what they have to do. So we have this 100 years of excessive force. All right. Now, here's where it gets complicated, okay? Here's where it gets complicated, especially right now in the current system. All right. 5% of you will cheat on every exam and every paper that you get. 5%. 5% of the population account for 51% of all arrests. 5% of neighborhoods account for 51% of all reports to the police. Now watch this. This is where it gets complicated. 5% of the police officers account for 50% of all the complaints that are registered by the public that result in a write-up by officers. Now watch this. If chronic offenders account for 65% of burglary arrests, 72% of robbery arrests, and 92% of homicide arrests, it is a structural pattern that 5%, no matter what even if it's white-collar crime, 5% of the corporations account for 51% of all malfeasance that's documented by the Department of Justice, right? 5%. So if you take 5% of the police officers who engage in an inordinate amount of malfeasance, and typically they're called the enforcers, because the enforcer is one who buys into the notion of crime control first and foremost. Now watch this. You put an enforcer inside of a hotspot and have them mingle with chronic offenders. You are creating a system without ever having excessive force, where excessive force is inevitably going to happen. And here's the reason why. You put a hothead in, because they're usually within the first 5 years of being hired, into a dangerous area, who believes in a crime control model rather than a social work model of justice, and guess what happens? Somebody speaks out in front of a group of people. Somebody stands up to their authority, their masculine authority disproportionately, their masculine authority in front of a crowd, where now they've got to stand up and they've got to be strong. Now, when you stand up in front of an enforcer that's 1 in 5% in a 5% neighborhood with a 5% chronic offender, you've now increased the odds of excessive force. And here's what's going to happen almost every time. Almost every single time, the police is going to make they're going to make an arrest and a charge for disorderly conduct first and resisting arrest. Go back and trace the history of everyone who's been shot by the police, and you're going to find resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. Why? Because the authority is undermined in front of a group. So for them to try to maintain the authority, they exceed, and then you get your adrenaline flowing, all this kind of stuff happens. Why? Because there's no love there. A lot of hate, a lot of prejudgment, but there's no love, right? So, are all the police bad? Not by a long shot. I teach chiefs and captains and sergeants and lieutenants. That's my job. I teach a specialized class every single year for on North Campus, only for the executive police officers, right? And none of them wake up any day and say, you know what, I can't wait to bust someone's head open. It never happens. But something does happen, and there's a process involved when it happens. And our problem is we refuse to take a look at the process underlying homicide, suicide, opioid addiction, and these types of forms of violence. We refuse to. Because if we looked at them, then we have to overthrow and overturn and change the way in which the dominant institutions operate. And nobody in power wants to take the money and the time necessary to reestablish the education institution. If you want to build an education institution that's based upon love, you don't build big mega schools that have 3,000 students with a 30 and 40 to 1 teacher ratio. It should be 5 or 10 to 1, correct? So if you want to show love to a student, what do? You give them extra attention. You find out what makes them tick. What is it that's bothering you? What makes you feel great? And then all of a sudden what you're doing is you're integrating them into the system. You're fighting off the egoism, and you're allowing them to have access to the resources for jobs later. Boom, you're integrating them into the social location, right, into the force of production. Now what have you done? Now all of a sudden you've changed the definition by which we define people in general. And I'll tell you, I know killers. I've worked in prison. I've met killers. Let me tell you something about killers. Most killers didn't want to kill. That's not why they're there. Most killers fell off early on because someone in their home didn't love them. My boy Madball, he was a basketball player, about 6'4", 6'5", could jump like Michael and all this kind of stuff. We played basketball. He was a Crip from the Rolling 60s out in California. And this guy tells me the first time anyone said they loved me, I was 16 years old and they jumped me into the Crips. Then I had one of my best friends, his name is Carl Upchurch out of Philadelphia, right? He went to prison 16 times for armed robbery, and he said, man, Sean, he said the first time someone said they loved me, I was 25 years old, right? We think this may be facetious. No, it has to do with the linkages that we have and the judgments that we have, the cultural capital and the social capital. Now watch this. You really want to address this issue? You want to address this issue? 1, take a look at the economics of it. 2, take a look at how the education system works. 3, provide entrepreneurship and black-owned businesses in these areas where you can't find these jobs, where the unemployment rate sits between 45 and 55%, and then we expect these persons to go work, and you can't, and then provide them with the opportunity. Well, provide them with entrepreneurship and some kind of local grants so they can start their own business. How about that? You want to come up with solutions? Fight the education system. Take a look at what the media is portraying. Are they accurate? Or look at evidence base of the media. If they're accurately portraying what's taking place in crime, we got to reflect and look at lethal violence altogether different, like we already said. Lethal violence comes at the hand of white males who kill themselves with a firearm, not between black males. That's number 2. So why isn't it we're looking at what lethal violence really is? Because we're not ready to. Now watch this. So what is the solution? What is the solution with policing? Ray Sikora from North Campus, the dean. I think he has come up with the most viable solution to excessive force. And what he has mandated for us to teach in the North Campus when people come through the police academy is what is called procedural justice. And that is, he teaches the officers who are going to get hired at MPD, Miami Police Department, and Miami-Dade, and it's been mandated through the state that all training institutions have to use procedural justice, which is you have to use a different conversation inside your head. 1, that you're dealing with a human being. So the first thing is that the other human being is treated with dignity first and foremost. The crime is committed, the crime is committed. Okay? That's already done. Now, you process that person as a human. 2, you got to be transparent with your intentions. 3, you have to let them know that the truth behind what's taking place. And 4, you got to take a look at it as a system of humanity. And so, procedural justice is the idea that you follow the procedures and not the emotional response to the situation. And if you do so with a different language system than one of authority controlling the controlled, right? If you do so over a long enough period of time, the police may not necessarily be regarded as the enemy, and the people in the neighborhood may not be regarded as the enemy. So when you institutionalize procedural justice as a practice, instead of the police being outside the stream, looking into the river, watching all these people connected as if somehow they're the enemy, but you put, and it's not community policing, that's a different type of process. You put the police in the stream where they have a stake in the stream and a connection to the stream, and you do this. Oh, watch this. At the grassroots level in these neighborhoods, there are people who have been in trouble, who know how to negotiate conflict between two people in a neighborhood, in a hotspot. And they call them violence interrupters. A violence interrupter is someone who is formerly a violent offender, who has the capacity for conflict management at this micro-interactive level. And what we have found is that when the formal authorities, the police, local community agencies, allow them to do what they do best, which is negotiate conflict at that level, guess what happens? The level of overall violence starts to decrease. And they've also been trained, if this young person right here has a specific need, let's say they're hungry, the violence interrupter finds that they're hungry, they can call the police department and get to the clearinghouse and say, where can we take this person to eat? Where can we find a place for their parents to get night school? In other words, we can assess the situation and come up with solutions rather than incarcerating this person, find up with a solution that is needs-based. And guess what? We've done this. We did it in Louisville, Kentucky, and drove down the homicide rate 50% in 1 year with Operation Restore. Boston did it with Operation Ceasefire back in the 1900s, the 1990s. They had 0 juveniles under the age of 18 murdered over a 4 or 5 year period because of this kind of process. By the way, go take a look at your homicide rates in Miami, and you will find that the homicide rate was in 2007 was 19.9 per 100,000. Just last year, it dropped to 9.1 per 100,000. Still higher than the national average, but 50% less than what it was. Why? Because the initiation of procedural justice. And what's happening is that you're increasingly having police officers go in places like Liberty City and play kickball with the kids. Right? At first, it's like, what are they doing here? Going to the churches, what have you. What are they doing in our community centers? But then, once you see that they come back, because usually what happens is when someone comes up with a solution from the outside and they come into the inside, they did this in our neighborhood all the time. We're like, they say they're going to do something, they never do, and they never did. So you can't, again, send a message that we're going to do something, then you walk away. That's what happened after Rodney King. We had all these plans of creating what were called standard economic zones all through the United States inner city urban areas. And we were going to flood those communities with money so that they could build up, black-owned businesses, some entrepreneurship, and all these kind of things. And the money never showed up. And what happened was they said, see, the money wasn't going to show up. This way, with procedural justice, people continue to show up. And when you show up, what you're really saying is you matter. And if you matter, then what happens is, it's not like you're going to date each other, but it is a sign of love, right? And it is a sign that there's a hope for a better day. And so when you can show love and hope, even love for your enemy, and you can show hope does exist, and you can bring in the resources to create structural change, and guess what? Hope does work. Oh, no wonder I called it that. That's the name of my company. Of course it's disproportionate. Yes, absolutely, Sandra. Their incarceration rates are grossly built around ethnic lines, for sure, in the United States. The lines are decreasing some, but because we can't afford it. I mean, we can't afford the incarceration rates that they used to afford. And so what we're finding is that we're letting people out the back door rather than just bring them in the front door and incarcerate for longer periods of time. But if you see what we're talking about, what I talked about today. If we change the nature of our discussion about lethal violence, first thing we do is we're changing the imagery that is portrayed. Secondly, if we take a look at how the media portrays crime and we question it, then all these antagonisms that are playing, those are going to be assuaged some because of the fact that the stereotypes are not on the table. You start playing with real evidence instead of this fake me out stuff that is driven by media and driven by political discourse. You take that stuff out of the equation and you allow real empirical evidence to start to talk and tell the truth of what's really taking place, then you're going to have a different type of scenario. And honestly, we don't have to have these kind of homicides that take place where a person who's running away, like the dude up in Atlanta, he's running away from arrest, he's going to die. Well, that's a capital offense that you're running. You know the squad's already coming in. There's other alternatives. Procedural justice is looking for the other alternatives, right? Because, when people are executed for looting a 12-pack of beer, I'm not supporting looting. I'm not saying that. I mean, it's a criminal offense. But does that mean you die because you wanted a 6-pack of beer for free? You're looking at economic disparity all through the community. Everything in the community is owned by outside resources. And like Samuel was saying earlier, you have an internal colony here. And you can't sit there and tell me that all of you haven't tried to get over on somebody at some point. You can't tell me you didn't want to hook up when you went into McDonald's. You can't tell me that. You can't tell me that when your boy brings you a pizza home that you're not happy about that pizza, right? Or they bring you back some ribs because they work in a rib joint, and you're going to tell me that you're not happy that they brought you some ribs for free? Come on, man. Come on. Come on. It's all in the way in which we define the situation, right? So take a look at the definition. Take a look at stereotypes, and then ask critical questions about what's in front of you. And it's not even about crime, okay? Listen, I'm way off tonight. I got to write this thing up, but okay. When you learn how to ask critical questions about the information that is pushed upon you, you are no longer passively accepting the words of a politician or a media outlet. When you learn how to question and critically assess the information that is being presented to you in this world, now you are establishing a situation in which you can stand on your own. And it's okay to follow a good leader, but you can't follow a leader who's taking you to the cliff to walk off. And the way our system is going with artificial intelligence and robotics and all these kind of things, you are going to be blamed for your own failure in the future. Why? 30% of the labor force that exists today will not exist then, and then 30% of the jobs that will exist haven't been imagined yet. And you're supposed to compete for 60% change? There's only going to be 40% there? And you will be blamed for that. So watch this. As you learn to critically assess the information, then you get to critically assess your pathway in this life. And when you look at those forces of production, those structural trends, right? And you take a look at those forces of direction, those cultural trends, and you really learn how to see where you fit into this system, whether it's because of ethnicity, gender, race, age, class, whatever. When you see how you fit in, and you can match your passions with your capabilities into the trends that are inevitably coming, you will be one of the few 5% that will be in control of your destiny rather than letting destiny control you. And the question is, which way do you want it to be? Do you want to be in control of your destiny, or do you want them to be in control of destiny? Because all I know is, when I flip on the news, I see the convergence between destinies that are not controlled ending up in excessive force. It's really simple. I am no longer a professor of criminology and sociology. I know the stuff, and I use it. I use it to structure the way in which I discuss things with you. But at this time, with the changes that you're looking at the greatest change, social change in history. In history. Which means you have to be different than what beings were historically. And so, the only thing I'm trying to give you is the ability to think for yourself, the ability to say, look at the world entrepreneurially, right? Look at it creatively, and to march and walk your path. Like my advisor used to tell me at Denison, I love this guy. He used to say, don't sing the song that everyone tells you to sing. Sing the song that you were meant to sing. You control your destiny. I wish you luck. Are there any questions over this stuff? Man, I got going, baby. You should see me in real life when I get going. Stephanie, I want you in control. 100%. Right? Now, Sandra, I know where you're coming from. And Sam, I know about you, man. I'll tell you what, for only having 6 people, boy, this was off the chain, wasn't it? Hot. You can only imagine what it's like when there's 20, 30, 40 people in a room. Whew, I get going. I'm funnier. It's hard to be funny when you're sitting in this chair in this hot-ass apartment, but, you know, whatever. Are there any questions with anything? Because if not, I'm going to go ahead and sign off, and I'm going to wish you a very happy New Year. Where's my head? I'm going to wish you a happy weekend. I know you have an assignment. I know it's up in Blackboard, so you can follow that. I appreciate you coming out on this optional class night. That's really fantastic. Send me your questions about Dear Mama so I can answer those on Monday. I'll be answering those. And of all things, we're almost done with the semester and we're only in week 3. Can you believe that? Yes. All right, hey Sam, you can text me. Now, I'll let you all know that the next couple of days I have a world of constraints. Because as soon as we get off here, I'm going to go get a Coke Zero, and then I'm going to write a couple chapters here tonight, which is going to be about, I'm going to write 40 or 50 pages before I go to bed. So I'm going to have to dig in and do that. But aside from that, you guys are just great, man. And Sandra, thank you for joining us. You're always welcome to. It was a pleasure having you in our midst and commentating and enjoying yourself, I hope. And you all, this is Schwaneezy signing off. I hope you have a great weekend. Boom! That's hilarious.